The sound of shattering glass echoed through the elegant private dining room as my mother-in-law's face transformed from smug satisfaction to utter disbelief. The champagne flute she'd been holding slipped from her perfectly manicured fingers as she processed what I'd just revealed. 3 years of calculated insults, deliberate exclusions, and thinly veiled hostility had led to this moment, her lavish 60th birthday dinner at the Newport, the most exclusive restaurant in the city. The very restaurant she didn't know I had helped build. "What did you just say?" Barbara whispered, her voice suddenly stripped of its usual commanding tone. I smiled, feeling a strange calm wash over me as I repeated words I should have said years ago. I said, "This dinner you're trying to exclude me from? I arranged it? This restaurant you've always dreamed of visiting? I helped make it successful. The owner you're so impressed by? She's one of my closest friends." The stunned silence around the table was worth every moment of the 3 years I'd spent trying to win this woman's approval, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where it all began. Because understanding how we arrived at this moment of perfect, satisfying clarity requires knowing just how hard I tried to be the daughter-in-law Barbara Taylor wanted. And before we jump in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Olivia Chen. I'm 32, a physical therapist with my own growing practice. And until that fateful dinner, I'd spent much of my marriage trying to decode why my husband's mother seemed determined to erase me from his life. The key irony was I'd never expected to marry into a family like the Taylors. Mark and I came from completely different worlds. His family's reality consisted of country club memberships and holiday homes, while mine was built on immigrant parents who worked multiple jobs to put me through college. We met when I was assigned as his physical therapist after a skiing accident left him with a complicated shoulder injury. The first time Mark Taylor wheeled into my clinic, I made a private bet with myself about how long he'd last before demanding a different therapist. With his expensive watch and perfect haircut, he looked exactly like the entitled patients who typically complained about my aggressive treatment approaches. I was wrong. Mark not only embraced the challenge of recovery, but showed up early, for every appointment with a determination that gradually revealed a person quite different from my first impression. During our 6th session, when he managed to complete a particularly difficult exercise sequence, I congratulated him with my standard high five. Instead of the polite tap I expected, he intertwined his fingers with mine and held on just a moment. Too long. "I think this might be ethically questionable," he said with a small smile. "But would you consider having dinner with me once I'm discharged as your patient?" 2 months later, after his final assessment, we had that dinner. And then another. And another. Mark wasn't just charming and thoughtful. He was genuinely kind in ways that caught me off guard. He remembered details about my family without prompting. He listened when I talked about my dream of expanding my practice. He showed up, consistently and completely. 6 months into our relationship, as we walked along the riverfront after dinner, Mark suddenly stopped and turned to face me. "I need to talk to you about something," he said, his expression uncharacteristically serious. My stomach dropped. In my experience, nothing good ever followed that phrase. "My mother has been asking to meet you." I blinked, surprised by the mundane nature of his concern. "Oh, well, that's normal, right? We've been together for months." Mark's hesitation was subtle but unmistakable. "My mother is complicated. I want you to be prepared." I laughed, squeezing his hand. "Mark, I grew up with a Chinese mother and grandmother under one roof. I know complicated women." He didn't smile back. "Barbara isn't just complicated. She's territorial. About me, about our family. My last serious girlfriend, she didn't handle it well. Looking back, I should have asked more questions. I should have pressed for details about what didn't handle it well actually meant. Instead, I did what many of us do when falling in love. I assumed that the strength of our connection would somehow transcend whatever challenges awaited us. "I'm not your ex-girlfriend," I assured him. "I'm pretty resilient." Mark finally smiled, though his eyes remained worried. "That's what I love about you." It was the first time either of us had used that word. Love. It hung in the air between us, momentous and new. Before I could respond, he leaned down and kissed me, and any concerns about his mother evaporated into the cool evening air. Our first meeting with Barbara was scheduled for Sunday brunch at her sprawling Tudor-style home in the most exclusive neighborhood in the city. As we pulled through the wrought iron gates and up the curved driveway, I felt the first flutter of genuine nervousness. "Your mom lives here alone?" I asked, taking in the manicured gardens and imposing facade. "Since my father died 5 years ago," Mark confirmed, "though she has full-time staff, housekeeper, groundskeeper, and a chef who comes in for special occasions." I smoothed down my carefully chosen dress, a conservative navy blue that I'd splurged on specifically for this meeting. My mother had always taught me the importance of first impressions, especially with potential in-laws. As a first-generation American, she'd navigated cultural differences her entire life and passed that vigilance on to me. "Remember," Mark said as he parked the car, "my mother can seem warm at first. Don't let it fool you into sharing too much, too quickly." Before I could ask what he meant, the massive front door swung open, revealing a slender woman with perfectly coiffed silver blonde hair. Barbara Taylor was indeed beautiful in that particular way that spoke of both good genes and meticulous maintenance. Smooth skin stretched a bit too tightly across elegant cheekbones, tailored clothing that showcased her trim figure, and jewelry that managed to be both substantial and understated. "Mark, darling!" she called out, her voice carrying across the driveway. She didn't move from the doorway, I noticed, expecting us to come to her. Mark placed his hand gently on the small of my back as we walked toward the entrance. I could feel tension in his touch, a subtle pressure that seemed to be both supportive and cautioning. "Mother," he said, leaning down to accept her kisses on both cheeks. "This is Olivia." Barbara's eyes assessed me with swift precision, a fleeting evaluation that I felt rather than saw. Then her face transformed with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Olivia, Mark has told us so little about you. I was beginning to think he was keeping you all to himself." Her emphasis on "so little" wasn't lost on me. Neither was the implied criticism of Mark for his privacy. But her tone was pleasant, even warm, and she extended perfectly manicured hands to clasp mine briefly. "It's wonderful to meet you, Mrs. Taylor," I said, matching her smile. "Your home is absolutely beautiful." "Oh, please call me Barbara. Mrs. Taylor makes me feel ancient." She laughed lightly, still blocking the entrance slightly. "And thank you. Richard and I bought this place when the boys were small. So, many memories within these walls." As she finally stepped aside to let us enter, I caught the first subtle sign of what Mark had warned me about. Barbara slipped her arm through Mark's, effectively separating us as she guided him into the house. "Thomas is already here with Rebecca," she informed Mark as I followed behind them. "They brought little Richard too. He's getting so big, nearly walking now." Thomas, I knew from Mark, was his older brother, the successful one, as Barbara frequently described him. Thomas had followed in their father's footsteps, joining the family investment firm straight out of college, and now served as its CEO. His wife Rebecca came from a family similar to the Taylors. Old money, right connections, perfect pedigree. We entered a sunlit dining room where a man who looked like an older version of Mark stood bouncing a chubby baby. Beside him, a willowy blonde woman arranged flowers in a crystal vase with practiced precision. "Here they are," Barbara announced, still holding Mark's arm. "Thomas, Rebecca, this is Olivia." Thomas handed the baby to Rebecca before approaching with an easy smile that seemed genuinely welcoming. "The famous Olivia. Mark talks about you constantly. It's good to finally put a face to the name. His handshake was firm, his manner direct but friendly. I immediately liked him, especially when he added, "Mark says you worked miracles with his shoulder. He couldn't stop talking about your revolutionary approach to rehabilitation." "She tortured me back to health," Mark joked, finally extracting himself from his mother's grip to return to my side. Rebecca approached next, the baby propped on her hip. "It's lovely to meet you," she said, her voice soft and modulated in a way that suggested expensive education. "This is little Richard," named after Mark and Thomas's father, of course. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "He's beautiful," I said, smiling at the baby who regarded me with solemn curiosity. "How old is he now?" 10 months next week, Rebecca replied, a hint of pride warming her otherwise reserved demeanor. "Would you like to hold him?" Before I could answer, Barbara interjected smoothly. "Let's get everyone seated first, shall we? The chef has prepared a special menu, and we wouldn't want anything to get cold." The brunch progressed with a surface pleasantness that almost concealed the undercurrents. Barbara dominated the conversation with practiced skill, asking me questions but subtly redirecting before I could answer fully. Each time I began to share something about my practice or background, she would interrupt with an anecdote about Mark's childhood or a family memory that pointedly excluded me. "Olivia, Mark mentioned you have your own physical therapy practice?" Thomas asked during a brief lull. "Yes, I started it 3 years. "Speaking of businesses," Barbara cut in, "Thomas, tell Mark about the new expansion the firm is considering. It's exactly the sort of project that would have made your father proud." This pattern repeated throughout the meal. Thomas and Rebecca made genuine attempts to include me in conversation, while Barbara systematically redirected focus. When dessert was served, an elaborate crème brûlée that Barbara informed us was Mark's absolute favorite since childhood. She placed her hand over her son's and squeezed gently. "Darling, have you thought more about what we discussed? The position at the firm is still open, and the board specifically asked for you." Mark stiffened beside me. "Mother, we've been through this. I'm happy at the architectural firm. My career is going well." Barbara's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course, dear. It's just that family traditions are so important. The Taylor men have always been part of the firm." "I'm still a Taylor man," Mark replied, a hint of steel entering his voice. "I'm just one who designs buildings instead of investment portfolios." An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. I knew from our conversations that this was a long-standing point of contention. Mark had broken family tradition by pursuing architecture instead of finance, a choice his father had eventually accepted but his mother never had. Rebecca, perhaps, sensing the tension, turned to me with a genuine smile. "Olivia, Mark mentioned you're planning to expand your practice. That's so impressive. Running your own business must be challenging." "It is, but I love—" "Speaking of challenges," Barbara interrupted, her voice taking on a concerned tone. "Mark, I noticed you wincing earlier. Is your shoulder bothering you again? Perhaps Olivia's treatment wasn't as successful as you thought." I felt Mark tense beside me, but before he could respond, I smiled directly at Barbara. "Actually, recovery is an ongoing process. I'd be happy to suggest some additional exercises if Mark is experiencing discomfort. That's the benefit of dating." "You're a physical therapist. Free consultations." Thomas laughed appreciatively, and even Rebecca smiled. Barbara's expression flickered briefly before she recovered, but in that moment, I saw it clearly, the flash of calculation behind her social mask. As we prepared to leave a few hours later, Barbara pulled Mark aside for a private word while Thomas helped me with my coat. "Don't take it personally," he said quietly. "She's like this with everyone who gets close to Mark. He's her favorite, though she'd never admit it." "I noticed," I replied, trying to keep my tone light. Does she ever warm up? Thomas considered this, then answered with surprising honesty. Not really, but if you love my brother, you'll figure out how to manage her. Rebecca has. I glanced over at Rebecca, who was gathering the baby's things with efficient movements. Any tips? Let her think she's winning the small battles, Thomas advised. Rebecca lets her plan the holidays, choose the gifts for little Richard, dictate the family traditions. It keeps the peace. Something about his suggestion didn't sit right with me. But before I could respond, Mark returned looking slightly strained. On the drive home, I waited for Mark to mention what his mother had said in their private conversation. When he remained silent, focused intently on the road, I finally asked, "So, how did I do?" Mark reached for my hand. "You were yourself. That's all I wanted." "But did she like me?" I pressed, already knowing the answer. Mark hesitated just a moment too long. "She will. She just needs time." 6 months later, Mark proposed on a weekend trip to the coast. We were walking along an empty beach at sunset, waves gently lapping at our bare feet, when he suddenly dropped to one knee in the wet sand. "I know this might seem fast," he said, looking up at me with those earnest blue eyes that had first caught my attention in the clinic. "But I've never been more certain of anything in my life. Olivia Chen, will you marry me?" The ring he held out was stunning, a vintage emerald surrounded by tiny diamonds. It was nothing like the massive solitaires I'd seen on Barbara and Rebecca's fingers, and I loved it all the more for that. "It was my grandmother's," Mark explained as he slipped it onto my finger. "My father's mother. She was independent and strong-willed, just like you. She would have adored you." We decided to share the news with both our families at once, arranging a dinner at my parents' modest but warm home in the suburbs. My mother spent days preparing, cleaning obsessively, and planning a menu that combined traditional Chinese dishes with American favorites to make the Taylors feel comfortable. "Be yourself," my father advised as he helped me set the table. "If they cannot see your worth, that is their loss, not yours." Barbara arrived exactly 12 minutes late, enough to make an entrance but not enough to be considered rude. She surveyed our home with the practiced smile I was beginning to recognize as her social mask, exclaiming over the quaint charm and interesting decor in ways that somehow managed to sound both complimentary and condescending. My mother, bless her, either didn't notice or chose to ignore the undertones. She welcomed Barbara with genuine warmth, ushering her to the seat of honor and serving her first from each dish. My father engaged Thomas in conversation about business, while Rebecca surprisingly rolled up her sleeves and insisted on helping in the kitchen despite my mother's protests. When Mark finally stood to announce our engagement, raising his glass with a wide smile, the reactions were telling. My parents beamed with genuine happiness. Thomas offered immediate congratulations. Rebecca gave me a warm, if slightly surprised, hug. Barbara's expression froze momentarily before she composed herself. "How unexpected," she said finally, her voice carefully modulated. "You've known each other such a short time. When it's right," Mark replied firmly, squeezing my hand. "Of course, darling," Barbara amended quickly. "I'm simply surprised you didn't mention you were considering such a serious step." The evening progressed with increasing tension beneath the polite conversation. When Barbara asked about our wedding plans, I explained that we were thinking of a small ceremony, perhaps at the botanical gardens where we often spent Sunday afternoons. "Small?" Barbara echoed, her eyebrows rising slightly. "But darling, what about the club? The Taylors have held family weddings there for generations. Your father and I were married there, as were Thomas and Rebecca. We want something that reflects both of us," Mark explained gently. Barbara's smile tightened. "Well, there's plenty of time to discuss it. These things take at least a year to plan properly anyway." "Actually," I interjected, "we're thinking of this fall." Just 6 months away. The silence that followed was palpable. Barbara set down her fork with deliberate precision. 6 months is hardly enough time to plan a proper wedding, especially for a family with our connections. People will need to arrange travel, clear their schedules. We don't want to wait, Mark said simply, and we want something intimate. Barbara turned to my mother, clearly expecting an ally in wedding traditions. Mrs. Chen, surely you want a proper celebration for your only daughter? Time to plan and prepare? My mother smiled serenely. In our culture, we believe that when two people are certain, there is no reason to delay happiness. 6 months is plenty of time for a meaningful ceremony. I could have hugged her on the spot for her diplomatic but firm support. Later, as the evening wound down, I overheard Barbara speaking to Mark in the hallway while I helped my mother clear dishes. Darling, she seems very nice. But are you certain? Barbara's voice was pitched low, but the concern in it was theatrical enough to carry. You're still young, and with your prospects, you could… Mother, Mark interrupted, his voice uncommonly stern. I love Olivia. She's going to be my wife. That's not up for discussion. Barbara sighed audibly. I just want what's best for you. Your father always said you were impulsive. Dad supported my decisions, even when they weren't the ones he would have made, Mark replied. That's what I need from you now. In the kitchen, my mother placed a gentle hand on my arm. That woman will be difficult, she said in Mandarin. But if he defends you like that always, you will be fine. The next 6 months proved her right on both counts. Barbara fought us on every wedding decision, from the venue to the guest list to the menu. What should have been a joyful time of planning became a series of exhausting battles. She insisted on inviting business associates we'd never met, argued that my desire for a partially Chinese ceremony was confusing for guests, and repeatedly scheduled appointments with wedding planners we hadn't hired. Mark stood firm on the major issues, but as the wedding approached, I could see the toll his mother's opposition was taking on him. After yet another tense phone call about the reception, he sat heavily on our couch, looking drained. Maybe we should have eloped, he joked weakly. I sat beside him, taking his hand. We still could. He smiled slightly. Don't tempt me. Then, more seriously, I'm sorry about my mother. I knew she'd be difficult, but this is beyond what I expected. It's not your fault, I assured him. And honestly, we're getting everything we want for our wedding. She's just wearing herself out fighting battles she can't win. Mark studied my face. How are you so calm about this? She's been awful to you. I considered my answer carefully. Because I know the difference between things that matter and things that don't. Getting married to you matters. Whether your mother approves of our centerpieces doesn't. He pulled me close, pressing a kiss to my forehead. Have I told you today how much I love you? Yes, but I don't mind hearing it again. We were married on a perfect autumn day in the botanical gardens, surrounded by close friends and family. My parents beaming with pride. Mark's brother Thomas standing as his best man, little Richard toddling down the aisle as our ring bearer. Even Barbara maintained a facade of maternal happiness, though she made sure everyone within earshot knew about the compromises she'd made for this unusual ceremony. During the reception, as Mark and I shared our first dance, I caught sight of Barbara watching from the sidelines. For just a moment, her social mask slipped, revealing something that looked surprisingly like vulnerability. In that brief, unguarded moment, I felt a flash of compassion. Perhaps her controlling nature came from a place of fear. Fear of losing her son, fear of change, fear of becoming irrelevant in his life. With that thought providing a new perspective, I made a decision. After our dance ended, I approached her directly, holding out my hand. Barbara, would you like to dance with your son? It's a moment you shouldn't miss. Surprise flickered across her face. followed by something almost like gratitude. "That's thoughtful of you, Olivia." As she moved past me toward Mark, she added quietly, "The ceremony was lovely. Different, but lovely." It wasn't much, but it felt like a tentative olive branch. As I watched them dance, Mark leaning down to say something that made his mother laugh genuinely for perhaps the first time that day, I allowed myself to hope. Maybe, just maybe, we could build something resembling a healthy relationship after all. I couldn't have been more wrong. The first year of our marriage brought a series of subtle but escalating boundary violations from Barbara. What began as weekly phone calls to Mark became daily check-ins. Holiday traditions suddenly became non-negotiable obligations. Any plans we made were subject to Barbara's approval or interference. When we mentioned we were considering buying our first home, Barbara arrived the next day with listings in her preferred neighborhood, conveniently just minutes from her house. "These properties rarely come on the market," she explained, spreading glossy brochures across our dining table. "I've already spoken to my friend at the realty office. She can show us these tomorrow." "Actually, Mother, we were looking further north, closer to Olivia's practice," Mark said carefully. Barbara's expression flickered. "But darling, you've always loved this neighborhood, and families should stay close together." "We'll consider all our options," I interjected smoothly, gathering the brochures. "Thank you for thinking of us." Later, after Barbara left, Mark apologized. "She means well." "Does she?" I asked quietly. "Or does she mean to keep you firmly in her orbit?" He had no answer for that. Despite Barbara's persistent suggestions, we eventually found a lovely craftsman-style home in a neighborhood halfway between my practice and Mark's architectural firm. It needed work. The kitchen was straight out of the 1970s, and the bathrooms weren't much better, but it had character and potential. "We can renovate over time," Mark said enthusiastically as we toured the house for the second time. "I can design the kitchen you've always wanted." I fell in love with the house for many reasons, but perhaps most of all because it was clearly not what Barbara would have chosen. It was uniquely ours. When we closed on the property 2 months later, we invited both our families for a small celebration. My parents brought champagne and homemade dumplings for good luck in your new kitchen. Thomas and Rebecca brought a beautiful houseplant and a gift card to a home improvement store. Barbara arrived last, her smile tight as she took in the original woodwork and outdated fixtures. Well, it certainly has potential. She handed us a heavy envelope. A housewarming gift. Inside was a check for $50,000 and a note that read simply, "For necessary improvements, I've taken the liberty of scheduling my interior designer to consult with you next week." Mark stared at the check in shock. "Mother, this is too much." "Nonsense," Barbara replied briskly. "The house needs significant work to be up to standards. I'm simply helping you achieve that more quickly." I recognized the maneuver immediately, financial control disguised as generosity. Before Mark could respond, I handed the check back to Barbara. "This is incredibly generous," I said carefully. "But we want to do the renovations ourselves, at our own pace. It's part of the experience of making our first home together." Barbara's eyes narrowed slightly. "Don't be ridiculous, Olivia. You both work full-time. You don't have the expertise or time for proper renovations." "Actually," Mark interjected, finding his voice, "as an architect, I do have the expertise. And doing the work gradually is part of our plan. Your father would never have allowed family to live in a home that needs this much work," Barbara replied, her voice taking on the familiar note she used whenever invoking Mark's late father. He believed in doing things properly, or not at all. It was a tactic I'd seen her employ repeatedly, using her late husband's supposed opinions to manipulate her sons. Most of the time, it worked on Mark, who still clearly grieved his father's absence. This time, however, he surprised me. Dad also believed in letting people make their own choices, Mark said firmly. Thank you for the offer, Mother, but we're declining. The tension that followed was broken only by Thomas, who cleared his throat and raised his champagne glass. To Mark and Olivia's new home, may it be filled with love and laughter for many years to come. Everyone drank, though Barbara merely pressed the glass to her lips without drinking. As the evening progressed, she made numerous comments about unsafe wiring in these old houses and the health hazards of outdated plumbing. By the time our guests left, my earlier optimism about building a relationship with my mother-in-law had evaporated completely. Barbara didn't want connection. She wanted control. And when she couldn't control Mark directly, she would attempt to control his environment, his choices, and by extension, me. Little did I know that Barbara's campaign was just beginning, and that her biggest move was yet to come. Our first year anniversary arrived in the midst of kitchen renovations. Mark had designed a beautiful space with custom cabinetry and a large island where I could indulge my growing interest in cooking. We'd spent weekends together tearing out the old linoleum, learning to install backsplash tile, and debating the merits of various countertop materials. Each decision we made felt like another brick in the foundation of our marriage. Choices that reflected both of us. Compromises that strengthened us. The night before our anniversary, I was putting final touches on a surprise I'd been planning for weeks. Mark's architectural firm had been competing for a major downtown revitalization project, and he'd been working late nearly every night, coming home with graphite-smudged hands and tired eyes, but undimmed enthusiasm. I wanted our anniversary to be special without adding stress to his already full plate. My phone rang just as I was hiding Mark's gift, a vintage drafting table I'd found at an estate sale and painstakingly restored in our guest room. Olivia. Barbara's voice was bright with artificial warmth. I'm so glad I caught you. I held back a sigh. Hello, Barbara. How are you? Wonderful, dear. Listen, I've arranged a special anniversary dinner for you and Mark tomorrow night at Le Bernardin. 8 o'clock. Thomas and Rebecca will join, of course. It's all taken care of. I blinked, momentarily speechless. Le Bernardin was indeed a beautiful restaurant, and completely contrary to the intimate evening I'd planned. That's very thoughtful, I said carefully. But Mark and I already have plans for our anniversary. A brief silence followed. What plans? Private ones, I replied, refusing to elaborate. But thank you for the gesture. Olivia, Barbara said, her tone shifting to something more authoritative. This reservation was extremely difficult to secure. The Taylor family has celebrated anniversaries at Le Bernardin for years. It's tradition. A tradition for you and your late husband, perhaps, I countered gently. Mark and I are creating our own traditions. I've already told Mark about it, Barbara said triumphantly. He seemed delighted. My heart sank. This was classic Barbara, going around me directly to Mark, knowing his instinct to please her often overrode his better judgment. Then, I'll discuss it with Mark when he gets home, I said, keeping my voice level. Do reconsider, dear, Barbara urged, the false sweetness returning to her tone. Family traditions are so important, don't you think? Especially as you and Mark think about starting a family of your own. The comment struck its intended target. Mark and I had been privately discussing having children, something we hadn't shared with either of our families yet. But Barbara had a knack for reading her son, for sensing shifts in his priorities and desires. As I said, I'll discuss it with Mark. Have a good evening, Barbara. I hung up before she could respond, then stood in our half-finished kitchen, mentally revising the evening I'd planned. The homemade meal now seemed inadequate compared to Le Bernardin. The intimate celebration suddenly felt small against the Taylor family tradition Barbara had invoked. When Mark came home an hour later, his eyes were bright with excitement despite the lateness of the hour. He swept me into a hug that lifted me off my feet. "We got it!" he exclaimed. "The revitalization project. My design was selected." Joy and pride surged through me. "Mark, that's incredible. I knew you could do it." He set me down but kept his arms around me. They specifically cited the community integration elements, the ones you helped me brainstorm. Said it set our proposal apart from the competition. I smiled up at him. "See? I told you those public garden spaces would make a difference." "We're celebrating this weekend," he said, kissing my forehead. "And our anniversary tomorrow. Double celebration." This was my opening. "About tomorrow. Your mother called." I felt him tense slightly. "What did she want?" "She's arranged an anniversary dinner for us at Le Bernardin, with Thomas and Rebecca." Mark pulled back slightly, frowning. "She did what? Without asking us?" Relief flooded through me at his reaction. "She said she already told you about it, that you seemed delighted." "I haven't spoken to her in 3 days," Marks said, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "This is exactly like her, making assumptions, then lying about my reaction to pressure you." "So you don't want to go?" I asked, wanting to be absolutely clear. "Of course not. It's our anniversary. I want to be alone with my wife." His expression softened. "I took tomorrow off work so we could spend the whole day together. I have plans." I raised an eyebrow. "Plans, huh? Care to share?" He grinned. "Nope, they're a surprise. But they definitely don't include my mother or a restaurant she chose." Later that night, as we lay in bed, Mark propped himself up on one elbow to look at me. "I should call her, tell her we're not coming." "Now?" I asked, glancing at the clock that read 11:42 p.m. "Not now. Tomorrow." He hesitated. "Unless you want to go, Le Bernardin is amazing." I touched his face gently. "I want whatever gives us time together, just us, and doesn't start our anniversary with conflict." Mark nodded, understanding my meaning. Declining Barbara's arrangement would inevitably lead to tension. "I'll handle it. It's my mother, my responsibility." True to his word, Mark called Barbara first thing the next morning. I couldn't hear her side of the conversation, but his responses told me everything I needed to know. "No, Mother, we have our own plans." "Yes, I understand it was difficult to get the reservation." "No, this isn't Olivia's decision. It's ours." "I appreciate the thought, but our anniversary is private." When he hung up, his jaw was tight with suppressed frustration. "She's canceling the reservation, but she made sure to tell me how disappointed Thomas and Rebecca will be, and how much money she's losing on the deposit." "Will Thomas and Rebecca actually be disappointed, or is she just saying that?" I asked, having learned to question Barbara's version of reality. Mark considered this. "Probably just saying it. Thomas texted me happy anniversary this morning with no mention of dinner." Our anniversary unfolded beautifully, despite Barbara's attempt to hijack it. Mark surprised me with a picnic at the botanical gardens where we'd been married, followed by a couple's massage at my favorite spa. That evening, I revealed the restored drafting table, now set up in our home office with a brass plaque engraved with the date of our wedding and the words, "Where dreams take shape." Mark's eyes grew suspiciously bright when he saw it. "It's perfect," he said, running his hands over the smooth wood. "How did you find this?" "I have my sources," I said mysteriously. In truth, I'd spent weeks checking estate sales and auctions, knowing he'd mentioned wanting one just like his grandfather's. As we enjoyed the dinner I'd prepared, nothing fancy, just Mark's favorites, my phone buzzed repeatedly with texts from Barbara. I ignored them until Mark finally said, "You should probably check those. She's likely working herself into a state." Reluctantly, I looked at my phone. "Barbara, Thomas and Rebecca wanted me to tell you they're very hurt by your absence tonight." Barbara, "The restaurant gave our table to another couple. After all the strings I pulled." Barbara, Mark's father and I never missed a family celebration. Family came first for us. Barbara, I hope you're at least taking him somewhere nice for your anniversary. She's laying it on thick, I said, showing Mark the messages. He shook his head. Thomas just texted me a photo of them at home with Richard, watching movies. They're not at any restaurant. Should we respond? Mark considered this, then took my phone and typed a single message. Enjoying a wonderful private anniversary. Evening. Please respect our time together. He showed it to me for approval before sending. When I nodded, he pressed send, then turned my phone off completely. There, he said, reaching for my hand across the table. Anniversary secured. The next morning, my phone contained 7 missed calls from Barbara and a voicemail expressing concern that she couldn't reach us and was worried something had happened. It was manipulation, plain and simple, but effective enough that Mark called her back immediately to assure her we were fine. You didn't need to turn off your phones, Barbara chided him, her voice audible from where I stood. What if there had been an emergency? What emergency, Mother? Everyone was fine. Well, I didn't know that, did I? I was up half the night, worrying. The guilt in Mark's eyes was exactly what Barbara had been aiming for. This was her pattern: create a situation, react disproportionately to the normal boundaries we set, then make Mark feel responsible for her feelings. As our second year of marriage progressed, Barbara's interference became both more subtle and more pervasive. She began establishing direct relationships with Mark's colleagues and clients, hosting dinner parties where she would introduce him as my son, the architect, with the air of someone indulging a child's hobby. She referred to his achievements as if they reflected primarily on her exceptional parenting rather than his talent and hard work. When Mark's revitalization project broke ground, Barbara arrived at the ceremony in a tailored suit that coordinated perfectly with Mark's firm's branding colors, positioning herself prominently for photos. Mrs. Taylor, you must be so proud, a local reporter said, thrusting a microphone toward her. Oh, indeed, Barbara replied with practiced modesty. I always encouraged Mark's little drawings when he was a boy. I saved them all, you know. Mark's little drawings had won a national design competition. His work would transform 10 city blocks into a vibrant community space. But in Barbara's narrative, it was all an extension of her influence. The reporter, sensing a story, pressed on. Did you always know he would become an architect? Well, Barbara laughed lightly, the Taylors have always been in finance, but I supposed every family needs its rebel. We've learned to accept Mark's alternative career path. I watched Mark's expression tighten as Barbara effectively diminished his professional accomplishments on what should have been one of the proudest days of his career. That evening, as we drove home in silence, I finally asked the question that had been growing in my mind for months. Mark, have you ever considered that your mother might be narcissistic? He glanced at me sharply. What? No, she's just traditional, protective. Protective of what, exactly? You're a successful, grown man. What is she protecting you from? Mark didn't answer immediately, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. She lost my father suddenly. It affected her deeply. Your father died 5 years before we met, I pointed out gently. And from what you've told me, she was controlling long before that. She's not perfect, Mark admitted, but she's my mother. Being your mother doesn't give her the right to undermine you or us. Mark sighed heavily. What do you want me to do, Olivia? Cut her off? She's the only parent I have left. His pain was real, and I softened immediately. No, of course not. I just think we need clearer boundaries, professional boundaries, personal boundaries. I'll talk to her, Mark promised. Whether he ever had that conversation, I couldn't say. But Barbara must have sensed something shift because her tactics evolved once again. Instead of directly interfering, she began a subtle campaign to separate us in the eyes of their social circle. It started with the holiday party at the country club. Barbara had insisted we attend, citing family tradition and social obligation. Mark, having recently completed his major project, felt we could spare the evening. As we entered the lavishly decorated ballroom, Barbara swept toward us, elegant in winter white that contrasted dramatically with her perfectly coiffed dark hair. "Mark, darling, finally!" She kissed his cheeks, then barely nodded at me. "Jennifer, how nice." "Olivia," Mark corrected automatically. "Of course, silly me," Barbara laughed, though she'd never once forgotten my name in the 2 years I'd been married to her son. "Come, Mark, there are people you simply must say hello to." She took his arm, effectively separating us, and guided him toward a group of distinguished-looking men across the room. I stood alone for a moment before making my way to the bar, ordering a glass of wine I didn't particularly want, just to have something to do with my hands. "Abandoned already?" I turned to find Rebecca beside me, looking stunning in a deep green gown that complemented her blonde coloring perfectly. "Barbara's annual maneuver," I said lightly. "Divide and conquer." Rebecca's smile was sympathetic. "She did the same to me for the first 3 years. Still does when she can get away with..." This surprised me. Rebecca had always seemed to be Barbara's ideal daughter-in-law, poised, from the right family, dedicated to raising little Richard according to Barbara's exacting standards. "Really? I thought you were the golden child." Rebecca laughed, softly. "Only because I learned to choose my battles. Barbara and I reached an understanding. Which is, she controls the public narrative. I control my actual life." Rebecca sipped her champagne. "For instance, she tells everyone I'm taking a break from my legal career to focus on motherhood, which fits her traditional values. In reality, I work from home 3 days a week as a consultant for my old firm, which she conveniently never mentions. This was news to me. I had no idea you were still practicing law." "Exactly," Rebecca said with a small smile. "That's the point. Barbara gets to present the version of our family that suits her, and in exchange, she doesn't actually interfere with the important things." That sounds exhausting. It is, but it keeps the peace. Rebecca glanced across the room to where Barbara now had Mark cornered with what appeared to be a very important couple. "The question is, what battles are you going to choose?" Before I could respond, Barbara's voice carried across the room with practiced projection. "Oh, Mark is handling the house renovation himself. So talented with his hands. Though I keep telling him, designers exist for a reason." The group around her laughed politely. "That right there," I said quietly to Rebecca. "That's a battle I might choose." The opportunity came sooner than expected. As the evening progressed, Barbara skillfully managed to keep Mark and me separated, introducing him to important contacts while periodically checking on me with superficial concern. "Are you enjoying yourself, dear? The crab puffs are just there if you're hungry. I know you mentioned once that you like seafood." Her solicitousness was for show, designed to present herself as the welcoming mother-in-law to anyone watching. What observers couldn't see was how she consistently steered Mark away whenever he tried to rejoin me, or how she interrupted any substantive conversation I managed to start. As dinner was announced, I discovered that Barbara had arranged the seating chart to place Mark at her table with several prominent community members, while I was relegated to a table of spouses near the back of the room. "Just a mix-up with the place cards," Barbara assured me with wide-eyed innocence when I inquired. "But the tables are set now, and you wouldn't want to disrupt the whole arrangement, would you?" I was weighing my response when Thomas appeared, at my elbow. "Actually, Mother, I took the liberty of fixing that particular mix-up," he said smoothly, producing 2 place cards. "Olivia will be sitting with her husband, and I'll join the Hendersons' table." Barbara's smile remained fixed, but her eyes flashed with irritation. Thomas, the seating was very carefully arranged for optimal networking. And what better networking for Mark than to have his accomplished wife beside him? Thomas countered pleasantly. After all, she's the one who suggested those community integration elements that won him the revitalization project. I shot Thomas a grateful look as Barbara was forced to concede with strained grace. As we took our seats, Mark squeezed my hand under the table. "Thank you for being patient," he whispered. "I know these events aren't your favorite." "They're growing on me," I replied, watching as Barbara rearranged her features into a semblance of maternal pride for the benefit of the distinguished man seated beside her. "They're certainly educational." The dinner itself was pleasant. Enough. Though Barbara managed to direct most of the conversation toward topics that highlighted her social connections and philanthropy work. Whenever the discussion turned to Mark's recent project success, she skillfully redirected. "Yes, Mark's little project has gotten such lovely press. Speaking of press, did you see the feature on the children's hospital wing Thomas's firm has funded? Such important work." By the time dessert was served, I had formed a plan. When Barbara rose to make what I knew would be one of her carefully crafted speeches about family and tradition, I excused myself and made my way to the event coordinator, a harried-looking woman checking items off a clipboard by the service entrance. "Excuse me," I said, offering my most winning smile. "I'd like to propose a toast after Mrs. Taylor's remarks. It's for my husband, a surprise to celebrate his recent professional achievement." The coordinator checked her list. "That's not on the program, Mrs. Taylor, Olivia Taylor. My husband is Mark Taylor, Barbara's son." Recognition flickered in her eyes. "Oh, of course. Let me just check with Mrs. Taylor Sr." "Actually," I said, lowering my voice conspiratorially, "it's meant to be a surprise for her too. A thanks to you for her support of Mark's career." This was a stretch bordering on fiction, but I maintained an earnest expression. The coordinator hesitated, then nodded. "Well, I suppose a brief toast would be fine. After Mrs. Taylor's remarks?" "Perfect." I returned to the table just as Barbara was clinking her glass for attention. Her speech was exactly what I expected. A carefully curated blend of family pride, social positioning, and subtle reminders of her own importance to every achievement mentioned. "And as we close another year," she concluded, raising her glass, "I'm reminded of what my late husband always said, family is the foundation of everything we build." To family, glasses raised around the room. To family, the crowd echoed. As the applause died down, I stood and tapped my glass gently. The room quieted in surprise. Public speaking was not typically my role at these functions. "If I could, just add a brief toast," I said, my voice clear and steady despite the flutter of nerves in my stomach. "To my husband, Mark." Mark looked up at me in surprise. Barbara's smile froze in place. "Many of you know that Mark recently completed the Westview Revitalization Project, which was featured in Architectural Digest last month." Murmurs of appreciation rippled through the room. What you might not know is that this project will create affordable housing for 60 families, community garden spaces accessible to local schools, and a healthcare outreach center. I directed my gaze around the room, making eye contact with several influential guests. Mark's vision wasn't just about beautiful buildings, though they certainly are beautiful. It was about creating spaces that serve the people who live in them, that build community rather than just housing it. Mark's eyes were fixed on me, a mix of surprise and something else, pride, perhaps, at hearing his work described in terms of its human impact rather than its prestige. "So I'd like to propose a toast to my husband, whose talent is matched only by his compassion, and who has taught me that the most meaningful structures we build aren't made of steel and glass, but of commitment to the people around us." The room raised their glasses with genuine warmth. "To Mark," came the response. As I sat down, Mark reached for my hand, squeezing it tightly. Across the table, Barbara's expression was a study in conflicting emotions, unable to object, to praise of her son, yet clearly unsettled by my unexpected assertion of presence. "Well," she said finally, her voice overly bright. "What a lovely surprise. Though perhaps next time, dear, we should coordinate our remarks. The program was quite full already." "Sorry about that," I replied with a smile that matched her own, for insincerity. I was just so proud, I couldn't contain myself. Later that night, as Mark and I drove home, he was unusually quiet. Just as I was about to ask if something was wrong, he pulled the car to the side of the road and turned to face me. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For seeing me. The real me, not the version my mother tries to present." His voice was thick with emotion. No one's ever described my work that way before, in terms of what it means to people, not what it means to my career or the firm or the family name. I reached out to touch his face. "That's because most people don't know you the way I do." He leaned into my touch. "My mother's never going to change, is she?" It was the first time Mark had directly acknowledged the pattern of his mother's behavior without immediately defending it. A small step, but significant. "Probably not," I admitted, "but we can change how we respond to her." Mark nodded slowly. "I'm starting to see that." The country club incident marked a turning point in our relationship with Barbara. Having seen me stand my ground publicly, however politely, she recalibrated her approach. Instead of directly interfering, she became more strategic, more patient in her manipulations. When we announced at Christmas that we were finally ready to start trying for a baby, Barbara's reaction was a masterclass in hidden agendas. "How wonderful!" she exclaimed, embracing Mark warmly before offering me a brief, perfunctory hug. I was beginning to worry, of course. The Taylor men have always been virile. Thomas and Rebecca conceived little Richard on their honeymoon, you know. The implication was clear. Any difficulty conceiving would be my fault, not Mark's. "We wanted to be settled in our careers first," I explained, though I owed her no explanation. "And finish the major house renovations." "Very sensible." Barbara nodded, though her tone suggested the opposite. "Though, of course, at your age, Olivia, one doesn't have the luxury of endless time." I was 33, hardly on the brink of geriatric pregnancy. But Barbara spoke as if I were approaching menopause. "Many women nowadays wait until their 30s to start families," I replied evenly. "It's quite common." "Of course, dear, and I'm sure you'll be blessed with children whenever the time is right." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "I've saved all of Mark and Thomas's baby furniture, you know. Solid mahogany. They don't make things like that anymore." Next came the helpful suggestions. Barbara began forwarding articles about fertility, foods, exercise regimens guaranteed to increase conception chances, and dire warnings about everything from cell phone radiation to plastic food containers. Each message was signed with, "Just trying to help, darling." When I didn't respond to these prompts, she switched tactics, sharing increasingly personal stories about her own quick conceptions with Mark and Thomas. "Just relax, dear," she advised, during an unwanted phone call. "Stress can affect fertility, you know. When I was trying for Mark, I conceived immediately after Richard and I returned from Bermuda. Perhaps you and Mark need a vacation. I'd be happy to arrange something at the lake house." The subtext was clear. The problem must be my tension around Barbara, not anything biological or timing related. 3 months into our journey to conceive, I arrived home from work to find Barbara sitting in our living room, a large photo album open on her lap and Mark looking trapped on the couch beside her. "Olivia? Perfect timing. I was just showing Mark his baby photos. Thought it might inspire you both." She turned the album toward me, revealing a photo of infant Mark in a christening gown. The Taylor christening gown. 6 generations have worn it. Richard looked so proud that day, I set down my bag, trying to mask my irritation at finding Barbara in our home without warning. "That's lovely. I didn't realize you were visiting today." "Oh, just a spur-of-the-moment thing. I was in the neighborhood and thought Mark might enjoy a trip down memory lane." Barbara turned another page. "Look, Mark's first steps. He was an early walker, only 10 months. Taylor men have always been advanced physically. Again, the implication. Any developmental delays in our future children would clearly come from my genetic contribution." Mark caught my eye apologetically. "Mother brought dinner," he explained. "I told her you'd probably be tired after work, but she insisted." "So thoughtful," I managed, though food was the last thing I wanted. What I really craved was a quiet evening alone with my husband, away from Barbara's loaded comments and constant reminders of Taylor family superiority. "Well, I'll just go warm everything up," Barbara announced, closing the album with deliberate care. "Mark, you should show Olivia the photos of you in the sailor suit. Always my favorite." As soon as she disappeared into the kitchen, Mark stood and came to me. "I'm sorry," he whispered. She showed up unannounced with 3 casseroles and started talking about grandchildren before I could even take her coat. "It's fine," I assured. Him, though it wasn't. "But maybe we should talk about house keys and drop-in visits." Mark nodded, running a hand through his hair in the way he did when stressed. "I know. It's just..." She seemed genuinely excited about the baby thing. It's the first time she's shown real enthusiasm about our life together. That gave me pause. Mark was right. Barbara's manipulations aside, this was the first time she'd expressed genuine interest in our future together, rather than trying to separate us or diminish our marriage. "You're right," I conceded. "That is progress in a way." "Dinner's ready," Barbara called from the kitchen. "I've made Richard's beef stroganoff, Mark's favorite growing up, and I brought that Pinot Noir you like, Mark. Olivia, I wasn't sure if you were drinking, considering." "Well, just in case, I brought sparkling cider too." The dinner that followed was a masterclass in passive-aggressive conversation. Barbara managed to interrogate me about my menstrual cycle, diet, and exercise habits while maintaining a veneer of concerned support. Each question came wrapped in a personal anecdote or medical fact that made it difficult to object without seeming defensive. "I read that green tea can decrease fertility," she remarked, eyeing my usual evening cup. "When I was trying for Thomas, I gave up everything but herbal tea, and of course no alcohol whatsoever, even before conception. The Taylor approach to parenthood has always been one of complete dedication." I set down my cup, determined not to let her see my irritation. "My doctor hasn't expressed any concerns about green tea, but I appreciate your input." "Doctors today are so permissive," Barbara sighed. "When I was having children, mothers were expected to sacrifice." Mark, sensing my rising tension, attempted to change the subject. "The stroganoff is delicious, Mother. Reminds me of Sunday dinners growing up. Those perfect family dinners," Barbara said wistfully. "Every Sunday without fail, all of us together at the table. No phones, no distractions, no work emergencies. Family came first in our home. I do hope you'll continue that tradition, Mark." The implication was clear. My busy physical therapy practice and occasional weekend appointments were a threat to proper Taylor family traditions. Never mind that Mark himself often worked weekends when project deadlines loomed. "Actually," I said pleasantly, "my parents had a similar tradition, though ours was Saturday dim sum rather than Sunday dinner. My grandmother would make everything from scratch." Barbara smiled tightly. "How ethnic. Though I suppose certain cultural traditions can be adapted to fit more conventional family structures." I felt Mark tense beside me at the barely veiled xenophobia in his mother's comment, but before either of us could respond, Barbara continued. "Speaking of family structures, have you thought about childcare arrangements? I assume you'll want to continue working, Olivia." modern woman that you are. Though in my day, mothers stayed home for at least the first 5 years. And there it was, the next battleground already being prepared. Barbara was positioning herself as the natural childcare provider for our yet-to-be-conceived baby, simultaneously criticizing my career while establishing herself as the authority on proper child-rearing. "We haven't made any decisions yet," Mark interjected firmly. "Obviously, we'll figure out what works best for our family when the time comes." "Of course, darling." Barbara patted his hand. "I just want you to know I'm available. After all, who better to watch a Taylor child than someone who's successfully raised 2 Taylor men?" As the evening finally wound down and Barbara gathered her things to leave, she pressed a small, gift-wrapped package into my hands. "Just a little something to help with your efforts," she said, with a meaningful look toward my abdomen. After she left, I unwrapped the package to find a book titled Conceiving the Taylor Way, a Comprehensive Guide to Fertility After 35. "Did she actually write this?" I asked, staring at the glossy cover featuring Barbara's photo. Mark took the book, flipping through pages of self-published advice. "Oh God," he groaned. "She had it made. It's filled with her personal theories and family photos." "This is a new level, even for her," I said, caught between laughter and horror. Mark tossed the book aside and pulled me into his arms. "I'm sorry," he whispered against my hair. "She's just excited about the possibility of grandchildren." "She already has a grandchild," I pointed out. "Little Richard, remember? Her perfect grandson from her perfect son and his perfect wife." "True," Mark acknowledged, "but this would be different." "Because it would be yours?" "Because it would be ours," he corrected, pulling back to look at me. "And that terrifies her. Another person in your life who might take priority over her." It was the most insightful thing Mark had ever said about his mother, and it struck me with the force of revelation. Barbara wasn't just controlling, she was desperately afraid of losing her place at the center of her son's world. Every manipulation, every boundary violation stemmed from that primal fear. The realization didn't excuse her behavior, but it helped me understand it. And understanding, I hoped, might eventually lead to a workable relationship. Not the one Barbara wanted, but one we could all live with. What I didn't realize then was how drastically things would change over the next year, or how Barbara's seemingly supportive interest in our future family would transform into the most direct challenge to our marriage yet. 6 months into our journey to conceive, I found myself sitting in my gynecologist's office, staring at the results of our fertility tests. Everything looked normal for both Mark and me. No obvious medical reason why we hadn't conceived yet. Dr. Patel, a warm woman with kind eyes and a straightforward manner, smiled reassuringly. "This is actually good news," she explained. "No structural or hormonal issues means we're likely dealing with unexplained infertility, which often resolves on its own with time. You're both young and healthy." "So we just keep trying?" I asked, trying to mask my disappointment. Part of me had hoped for a clear diagnosis, something concrete we could address. For now, yes. Though given that you've been trying for 6 months with good timing, I'd recommend we start some basic interventions. Nothing invasive yet. Let's begin with medicated cycles to ensure optimal ovulation. I nodded, absorbing the information. "And what about stress? Everyone keeps telling me to just relax as if that's the magic solution." Dr. Patel's expression turned sympathetic. The most common and least helpful advice given to couples experiencing fertility challenges. While extreme stress can affect hormonal balance, normal day-to-day stress isn't the problem. And people telling you to just relax usually creates more stress, not less. "Tell that to my mother-in-law," I muttered before I could stop myself. "Family pressure?" Dr. Patel asked knowingly. "You could say that. She has opinions about everything, especially this." Dr. Patel nodded. "That's not uncommon. Many of my patients find setting boundaries with family during this process is almost as important as the medical aspects. This journey is intimate and can be emotionally challenging. You get to decide who's part of it and how much they know. Her words resonated deeply. In our eagerness to start a family, Mark and I had perhaps shared too much with Barbara too soon. Now she felt entitled to constant updates and input on a process that should have been private between husband and wife. On the drive home, I contemplated how to discuss this with Mark. He'd been supportive throughout, accompanying me to appointments and learning about ovulation tracking with endearing seriousness. But he still struggled to set firm boundaries with his mother, especially when she framed her interference as concern or assistance. I found Mark in our home office, working on preliminary sketches for a new community center project. He looked up as I entered, his expression immediately questioning. "Everything's normal," I said, answering his unspoken query. "Dr. Patel says we're both healthy, and she's recommending some medicated cycles to boost our chances." Relief washed over his face. "That's good, right? Nothing seriously wrong?" "Right. Just unexplained infertility, which is apparently quite common." I perched on the edge of his desk. She also mentioned something else that made sense to me: the importance of keeping this journey private and setting boundaries with family. Mark's expression shifted, wariness replacing relief. "You're talking about my mother." "Among others," I conceded, though Barbara was certainly the primary concern. "It's just, this is already emotional and difficult. Having your mother analyze every aspect and offer constant advice adds pressure we don't need." Mark sighed, setting down his pencil. "I know she can be overbearing, but she means well. Having grandchildren is important to her. This isn't about her, though. It's about us, our family, our process." I chose my next words carefully. "I think we should stop giving her updates about my cycles or our doctor appointments. Those details are private." To my surprise, Mark nodded slowly. "You're right. I've been uncomfortable with how much she asks, too. I just didn't want to upset her." "She'll be upset regardless," I pointed out gently. "But that's not our responsibility to manage." Mark reached for my hand. "Okay, new boundary established. Fertility, details stay between us. If she asks, I'll tell her we're working with doctors and that's all she needs to know." I squeezed his hand gratefully. "Thank you." True to expectations, Barbara didn't take our new boundary well. The next time she called Mark and casually inquired whether I was in my fertile phase, he politely but firmly told her we wouldn't be discussing those details anymore. "But how will I know when to pray for conception?" she protested, her voice carrying clearly through the phone. "You can pray anytime, Mother," Mark replied evenly. "But Olivia and I have decided to keep the medical aspects private." After that conversation, Barbara shifted tactics. Since she couldn't extract information directly, she began what I could only describe as fertility surveillance. She sent packages of prenatal vitamins and fertility teas to our house with notes saying, "Thought you might need a refill." She called at strategic times of the month with just a feeling that she should check on us. She even coordinated with Rebecca to inquire, casually, whether I'd declined wine at family gatherings. As summer turned to fall, we progressed to our first round of medicated cycles with timed intercourse. The process involved regular ultrasounds to track follicle development, trigger shots to precisely time ovulation, and progesterone supplements afterward. It transformed what had been a natural, intimate aspect of our marriage into something scheduled and clinical. One evening, as I prepared to give myself the trigger shot, Mark watched with a mixture of concern and helplessness. The hormone injections had left me bloated and emotional, side effects the doctors had warned about, but that still caught us by surprise with their intensity. "I hate seeing you go through this," he admitted as I swabbed my abdomen with alcohol. "It's worth it," I assured him, though in my darker moments, I sometimes wondered if we were putting ourselves through too much, too soon. We were still relatively early in our fertility journey compared to many couples. Just as I was about to administer the injection, the doorbell rang. "Ignore it," I said, concentrating on the needle angle. The doorbell rang again, followed by insistent knocking. Then, Barbara's voice called through the mail slot. "Mark? Olivia? I know you're home, the lights are on." "I've brought dinner." Mark closed his eyes briefly in frustration. "I'll get rid of her." I nodded gratefully and retreated to the bathroom to complete the injection in private. Through the door, I could hear Mark's conversation with his mother. "This isn't a good time, Mother." "Nonsense. It's dinner time and I've brought Richard's famous pot roast. Is Olivia feeling unwell again? She's been so delicate lately." "We're in the middle of something private." "Private? What could be so private that you'd turn away your own mother? Unless..." "Oh, are you two trying right now? Is it the fertile window?" I cringed at Barbara's audacity. Even through a closed door, I could hear the hopeful excitement in her voice and imagine her attempting to push past Mark into our home. "Mother." Mark's voice took on a firmness I rarely heard him use with Barbara. "You need to leave. Now. We'll call you tomorrow." "But the pot roast." "Take it with you or leave it on the porch. Your choice. But this evening is not happening." I heard the front door close firmly, followed by the sound of the deadbolt turning. When I emerged from the bathroom, Mark was leaning against the wall, looking both exhausted and proud. "You sent her away," I observed, unable to keep the surprise from my voice. "I did." He straightened up. "And I'm turning off our phones for the night. Whatever crisis she manufactures can wait until tomorrow." That night marked another small but significant shift in our marriage. Mark was beginning to understand that protecting our relationship sometimes meant disappointing his mother. It wasn't consistent yet. He still gave in to her manipulations more often than not, but progress was undeniable. Our first 3 medicated cycles failed, despite perfect timing and textbook hormone levels. Each negative pregnancy test hit harder than the last, bringing a grief that felt disproportionate yet utterly genuine. Dr. Patel suggested we consider moving to intrauterine insemination, IUI, a more involved procedure that would bypass any potential cervical issues. As we discussed this next step, the holiday season approached, and with it, the inevitable increase in family obligations and Barbara's presence. Thanksgiving would be at Thomas and Rebecca's home this year, a small mercy, since it meant Barbara wouldn't have complete control over the event. Still, I dreaded the scrutiny and the inevitable questions. The day before Thanksgiving, Mark found me staring into our closet, unable to decide what to wear. "Everything okay?" he asked, wrapping his arms around me from behind. "Just trying to figure out what outfit will generate the fewest pregnancy speculations," I admitted. "Fitted clothes will have your mother measuring my non-existent baby bump. Loose clothes will have her assuming we're hiding something." Mark rested his chin on my shoulder. "Wear whatever makes you comfortable, and if anyone comments, I'll handle it." I turned in his arms to face him. "Promise? Because the last 3 family gatherings, you've said that, then disappeared into conversations with your cousins while I fielded invasive questions alone." He had the grace to look contrite. "Fair criticism. I promise this time will be different." Thanksgiving Day arrived cold and clear. We pulled up to Thomas and Rebecca's elegant colonial home just as Barbara was being helped from her car by Thomas. She wore a designer coat in deep burgundy and carried what appeared to be multiple dishes despite the fact that Rebecca had assigned her only one item for the potluck. "Perfect timing," she called as we approached. "Mark, be a dear and carry these inside. I've made my special cranberry relish and an extra pumpkin pie, since Rebecca's tends to be a bit dense." Mark dutifully took the dishes while I grabbed our contribution from the back seat, a sweet potato casserole made from my grandmother's recipe. As we entered the warm house filled with delicious smells, little Richard, now nearly 3, came running to greet us. "Uncle Mark, Auntie Liv," he shouted, launching himself at Mark's legs. Mark laughed, somehow managing to balance Barbara's dishes while giving his nephew a one-armed hug. "Hey, buddy! Happy Thanksgiving!" Richard turned, his attention to me next, his small face serious. "Mommy says you might have a baby in your tummy soon. Can I see it?" A hush fell over the entryway. Rebecca appeared from the kitchen, her expression mortified. "Richard, that was a private grown-up conversation. Remember what we said about private conversations?" "Not for sharing," Richard recited obediently, though he looked confused about what he'd done wrong. I knelt down to his level, keeping my voice light despite the knot in my stomach. "No baby in my tummy yet, buddy, but you'll be one of the first to know when there is, okay?" He nodded solemnly. "I'll be a good cousin. I'll share all my toys." "That's very generous," I told him, giving him a quick hug before standing to face the adults. Barbara was watching the interaction with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. Part disappointment, part calculation. "Children are so refreshingly honest," she remarked. "Out of the mouths of babes, as they say." Rebecca mouthed, "I'm so sorry" to me as she ushered Richard back toward the playroom. Thomas took the dishes from Mark with an apologetic grimace. "Mom, why don't you check on your cranberry relish? I think it needs to be transferred to a serving dish," he suggested, effectively redirecting Barbara to the kitchen. Once she was out of earshot, Thomas turned to us. "Sorry about that. Mom's been interrogating Rebecca about your situation. We've tried to deflect, but you know how she is." Mark's jaw tightened. "We've asked her to respect our privacy about this." "Good luck with that," Thomas replied with the weary resignation of someone who'd fought similar battles and lost. "Listen, Rebecca and I decided you two should know. Mom's planning some kind of fertility intervention today." "She's what?" I asked, alarm rising. "She mentioned bringing a fertility specialist to dinner. Some woman from her country club who supposedly has revolutionary methods for difficult C cases." Thomas looked genuinely sympathetic. "We tried to talk her out of it, but she's convinced she's helping." Mark ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I recognized as his trying to contain frustration. "When is this person coming?" "That's the thing. She's already here. Mom brought her as her +1. She's in the living room setting up some kind of display." I exchanged a look with Mark, a silent communication passing between us. This crossed every boundary we'd attempted to establish. It was intentional, public, and designed to be impossible to politely deflect. "We need a minute," Mark told his brother, taking my elbow and guiding me toward the coat closet, the only private space readily available. Once inside the small space, surrounded by winter coats and holiday decorations, Mark spoke in an urgent whisper. "I'm so sorry. I had no idea she would go this far. This isn't just crossing a line, Mark. This is bulldozing over it with a marching band and fireworks." I fought to keep my voice low despite my anger. "She invited a stranger to a family Thanksgiving to publicly dissect our fertility struggles. How much more humiliating could she make this?" "We should leave," Mark said decisively. "Make an excuse and go." I considered this option, tempting as it was. If we leave, she wins. She gets to tell everyone how oversensitive and uncooperative I am, how I'm denying her precious grandchildren by not following expert advice. "Who cares what she tells people?" Mark countered. "We know the truth." "I care," I admitted. "I'm tired of being painted as the difficult daughter-in-law. I'm tired of her manipulations succeeding." Marky studied my face in the dim light of the closet. "What do you want to do?" I took a deep breath, an idea forming. "I want to beat her at her own game, just this once. But I need you to back me completely, no matter what I say or do out there." "Can you do that?" "Absolutely," he promised, and, for the first time, I fully believed him. We emerged from the closet to find everyone being called to the dining room. Barbara stood near the head of the table beside a severe-looking woman in her 60s with impeccably styled silver hair and an abundance of jade jewelry. "Everyone," Barbara announced as we entered. "This is Meredith Holbrook. She's a holistic fertility consultant who's helped countless couples overcome their challenges. I've invited her to share her wisdom with us today, especially with Mark and Olivia, who have been struggling so unnecessarily." Meredith stepped forward, extending bony fingers adorned with multiple rings. "Barbara has told me all about your situation. I've helped women much older than you conceive, dear. My methods combine Eastern philosophies with cutting-edge nutritional science." I shook her hand briefly, maintaining a pleasant expression that revealed nothing of my internal fury. "How kind of you to join our family Thanksgiving." Barbara beamed, clearly interpreting my politeness as acquiescence. "Meredith has brought informational packets for everyone and some special teas for you, Olivia, and she'll be doing individual consultations after dinner." "Individual consultations? At Thanksgiving dinner?" Thomas interjected, clearly uncomfortable with the direction things were taking. "Just brief ones," Barbara assured him. "Fertility is a family affair, after all." I could feel Mark tense beside me, but I placed a calming hand on his arm. "Before we begin," I said pleasantly, "I'd love to understand Meredith's credentials." "Oh, she's highly qualified," Barbara rushed to say. "Decades of experience." I kept my focus on Meredith. "Medical degree? Certification in reproductive? Endocrinology, perhaps?" Meredith shifted slightly. "My approach is holistic, drawing from traditional wisdom that predates modern medicine. I studied with masters in Nepal and China." "Fascinating," I commented. "And your success rates? Do you have data on clinical outcomes compared to standard medical interventions?" "My clients' testimonials speak for themselves," Meredith replied stiffly. "I've helped women whom doctors declared hopeless." "Olivia," Barbara interjected, her smile becoming strained. "These questions can wait until your consultation. We don't want to bore everyone with technical details." "Actually," Rebecca spoke up unexpectedly, "I'm interested in the answers too, especially if we're turning Thanksgiving dinner into a fertility clinic." Barbara shot her a betrayed look, but Rebecca met her gaze steadily. It struck me that perhaps I'd underestimated my sister-in-law's willingness to challenge Barbara's overreach. "Perhaps we should sit down to dinner," Thomas suggested diplomatically. "The turkey's getting cold." We arranged ourselves around the table, with Barbara strategically placing Meredith between herself and me. Mark sat on my other side, his hand finding mine under the table in silent support. As Thomas began carving the turkey, Barbara launched into a detailed explanation of Meredith's revolutionary program, which seemed to consist primarily of expensive supplements, restrictive diets, and vague spiritual practices. Throughout her monologue, I maintained a pleasant, interested expression while squeezing Mark's hand so tightly my knuckles turned white. "The most important element," Meredith added as plates were passed around, "is eliminating negative energy and toxic influences. Stress is poison to fertility." "Speaking of toxic influences," I said evenly, taking a sip of water, "I've been reflecting lately on how external pressure affects conception rates. Dr. Patel, our reproductive endocrinologist, has shared some fascinating research on how familial interference can actually reduce success rates in fertility treatments." Barbara's fork clattered against her plate. "Familial interference? What an odd term for family support." "Support is only supportive when it's wanted," I pointed out. "Otherwise, it's intrusion." An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. Little Richard, oblivious to the tension, loudly requested more cranberry sauce, prompting a flurry of activity as Thomas passed the dish. "Well," Barbara finally said, her voice artificially bright, "I'm sure you don't mean to sound ungrateful, Olivia. Not when everyone here only wants to help you overcome your challenges. My challenges? I echoed. Interesting phrasing, considering we don't actually know which of us is contributing to our unexplained infertility. It could just as easily be a Taylor sperm issue as anything on my side. Mark choked slightly on his water, but when I glanced at him, he gave me a subtle nod of encouragement. Thomas looked like he was struggling not to laugh, while Rebecca suddenly became very interested in cutting Richard's turkey into smaller pieces. Barbara's face flushed. Taylor men have always been exceptionally virile. Mark was conceived on our honeymoon, you know. Genetics are fascinating, I agreed, pleasantly. Though male fertility has declined significantly in the general population over the past few decades, environmental factors, mostly. Perhaps, Meredith interjected, clearly trying to regain control of the conversation. We should focus on the positive. My program addresses both partners' fertility, though women typically require more intensive intervention. Based on what evidence? I asked, maintaining my polite tone. Most reproductive endocrinologists begin with a complete workup of both partners, since approximately 40% of infertility cases involve male factors. Do your protocols include analysis of sperm parameters, DNA fragmentation testing? Varicocele. Screening? Meredith blinked rapidly. My methods are more holistic. So that's a no on the evidence-based approach then, I concluded. Barbara set down her fork with a sharp click. Olivia, there's no need to be hostile. Meredith is a guest in Thomas's home. A guest you brought specifically to discuss my reproductive system over Thanksgiving dinner, I countered, still smiling pleasantly. I'm simply engaging with the topic you insisted on introducing. Mark cleared his throat. Mother, we've asked you repeatedly to respect our privacy regarding this matter. Bringing a stranger to family Thanksgiving to conduct fertility consultations crosses every reasonable boundary. I was only trying to help, Barbara protested. You've been trying for so long with no success. Clearly, whatever you're doing isn't working. 8 months is hardly so long in fertility terms, I replied. Many completely healthy couples take up to a year to conceive naturally, and we're working with actual medical professionals. Well, those professionals haven't gotten you pregnant yet, have they? Barbara snapped, her facade of concern finally cracking to reveal the judgment beneath. Mom, Thomas cut in sharply. That's enough. Barbara turned to him in surprise. Thomas rarely contradicted her directly. I'm simply stating facts, dear. You're being cruel, Rebecca corrected quietly. And you're ruining Thanksgiving. Perhaps, Meredith suggested, looking increasingly uncomfortable. We should table this discussion until after the meal. Excellent idea, I agreed. In fact, let's table it indefinitely. Mark and I won't be participating in any consultations today or ever. Barbara's expression hardened. I see Olivia is making decisions for both of you now, Mark. That's concerning. Actually, Mark replied firmly, this is a decision we made together, weeks ago, when we asked you to stop interfering in our fertility journey. You chose to ignore our clearly stated boundary, and now you're facing the consequences of that choice. Barbara's mouth opened and closed in shock. Never had Mark spoken to her so directly, especially in front of others. For a moment, the table was completely silent except for little Richard humming tunelessly as he arranged his food into patterns. I think, Barbara finally said, her voice tight with suppressed emotion, that I've lost my appetite. Meredith, perhaps we should go. In the middle of Thanksgiving dinner? Thomas asked incredulously. Mom, you're overreacting. Am I? When my own son speaks to me this way? When my attempts to help are met with hostility and scientific jargon meant to confuse and dismiss? Barbara's voice took on the wounded tone I recognized as her favorite. Defense mechanism. Perhaps I'm simply not welcome at this Thanksgiving table. She looked expectantly at Mark, clearly waiting for him to backpedal and apologize as he typically did when she employed this tactic. Instead, he met her gaze steadily. "If you choose to leave, that's your decision, Mother. But I hope you'll stay and enjoy the meal Thomas and Rebecca have worked hard to prepare, without further discussion of our private medical matters." Barbara seemed genuinely blindsided by Mark's response. Her gaze darted around the table, looking for an ally, but found none. Even Meredith was studiously examining her plate, clearly regretting her involvement in the family drama. "Well," Barbara said after a long moment, "I suppose I can stay for Richard's sake. He shouldn't have his Thanksgiving ruined." It was the closest thing to a concession we were likely to get. Slowly, conversation resumed around less controversial topics. Thomas discussed a community project his investment firm was funding. Rebecca mentioned a pro bono case she was consulting on. Mark described his latest architectural commission renovating a historic downtown theater. Throughout the meal, Barbara remained uncharacteristically quiet, though I occasionally caught her watching Mark and me with an expression that made me uneasy. It wasn't anger or hurt. Those would have been expected. Instead, she seemed to be recalculating, reassessing her approach. I'd seen that look before when her obvious manipulations failed. It typically preceded more subtle, insidious tactics. As dessert was served, both Rebecca's pumpkin pie and Barbara's competing version, Barbara suddenly brightened, as if remembering something important. "I almost forgot to mention," she announced, her voice returning to its normal, authoritative tone. "I've arranged a family portrait session for Christmas. The photographer is exceptional. He does all the governor's family photographs, and he's agreed to a special session on Christmas Eve morning." "That sounds lovely," Rebecca responded cautiously, clearly searching for the hidden agenda. "At your house?" "Actually, at the Newport," Barbara replied, casually dropping the name of the most exclusive restaurant in the city. "I've reserved the private dining room for Christmas Eve dinner. I thought we'd do photographs, then celebrate together." My stomach tightened. The Newport had a 6-month waiting list for reservations. Barbara must have planned this well in advance, likely around the time we'd first mentioned trying for a baby. "The Newport," Thomas repeated, looking impressed despite himself. "That's quite a Christmas gift, Mom." "Well, family is everything," Barbara said sweetly. "And I wanted this year to be special. The Taylors, all together at the finest table in the city." Her gaze slid to me as she emphasized Taylors, the implication clear. This was to be a family gathering on her terms, in a public setting where any objection would seem ungracious or petty. "It's very generous," Mark acknowledged, "though we typically spend Christmas Eve with Olivia's family." "Oh, I've already spoken with Olivia's mother," Barbara waved her hand dismissively. "She agreed your family could have you for Christmas Day instead. So accommodating. Your mother." I nearly choked on my pie. "You called my mother? Without discussing it with us first? Just streamlining the holiday arrangements, dear. No need to make such planning a burden on you when you're so focused on other matters." Her gaze dropped meaningfully to my midsection. "When, exactly, did you speak with my mother?" I asked, keeping my voice carefully neutral. "Last week, I believe. Such a pleasant woman, though her English can be a bit difficult to understand at times." My mother, who had come to the United States at age 12 and spoken perfect, barely accented English for decades, would have found this assessment interesting indeed. "That's strange," I replied, "considering my parents left for Taiwan 2 weeks ago to visit my grandmother. They won't be back until December 15th. Barbara's smile faltered slightly. Perhaps it was longer ago than I recalled. Or perhaps, Mark suggested quietly, you didn't speak with them at all. The table fell silent once again. Barbara's lips pressed into a thin line as she realized her lie had been exposed. Well, the details hardly matter, she recovered smoothly. The point is, I've made these wonderful arrangements for our family, and I expect everyone to attend. The photographer has been paid, the dining room reserved. Everything is set. We'll need to check our calendar, I replied, meeting her gaze directly, and speak with my parents ourselves about their preferences. Barbara's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, but her social mask remained firmly in place. Of course, dear, though I'd appreciate confirmation soon, as the Newport will need a final head count. They're being quite accommodating, considering their usual policies. As the evening finally drew to a close and we gathered our coats to leave, Barbara pulled Mark aside for a private word. I busied myself helping Rebecca clear dessert plates, but kept an eye on their interaction across the room. Whatever Barbara was saying, Mark's expression remained impassive, though his posture grew increasingly rigid. When he rejoined me at the door, his face was tight with controlled anger. "Everything okay?" I asked as we walked to our car. "She thinks she's so clever," he replied, his voice low. "Do you know what she just told me? That she's arranged for the fertility specialist from the Cleveland Clinic to join us at the Newport on Christmas Eve, as her special gift to us." I stopped in my tracks. "She what?" "Apparently, this doctor owes her a favor and has agreed to discuss our case over Christmas dinner. She's already sent our medical records to him." "Our medical? How would she even have access to those?" I sputtered, genuinely shocked. Mark's expression was grim. "She claims her friend on the hospital board helped her. I'm not sure if she's bluffing or if there's actually been a privacy violation, but either way, she's gone too far," I finished, a cold determination settling over me. "This isn't just boundary crossing anymore, Mark. This is potentially illegal." He nodded, helping me into the car before walking around to the driver's side. As he slid behind the wheel, he turned to me with uncharacteristic resolve. "I think it's time we stopped playing defense with my mother and actually took a stand," he said. "No more polite deflections or gentle reminders. She needs to face real consequences." "What did you have in mind?" I asked, surprised but pleased by his shift in attitude. "First, we're definitely not going to her Christmas Eve ambush. Second, I'm calling the clinic tomorrow to find out if she actually accessed our medical information. And third," he paused, taking a deep breath, "I think we need to take a break from her. Completely. At least through the holidays." Coming from Mark, who had never suggested any significant separation from his mother, this was revolutionary. I reached across the console to take his hand. "Are you sure? Christmas is a big line to draw." "I'm sure," he said firmly. "What she did today was calculated and cruel, and it won't stop unless we make it stop." As we drove home through the dark November evening, I felt a curious mix of emotions: anger at Barbara's escalating interference, concern about the potential privacy violation, but also a growing hope that perhaps Mark was finally ready to establish the boundaries we so desperately needed. What I didn't yet understand was that Barbara had one more move to make, one that would force a confrontation none of us were prepared for, at the very restaurant she'd so carefully selected for her Christmas manipulation. December arrived with twinkling lights and holiday music, but the usual festive spirit felt dampened by the constant shadow of Barbara's impending Christmas Eve ambush. Mark had called the Cleveland Clinic as promised, and while they assured him no unauthorized access to our medical records had occurred, the episode left us both unsettled. Barbara had been bluffing about obtaining our files, but the fact that she'd even consider such a violation spoke volumes about her disregard for our autonomy. We decided to spend Christmas Eve with my parents after all, who had indeed returned from Taiwan as scheduled. When Mark called Barbara to decline her invitation to the Newport, the conversation quickly deteriorated. "This isn't optional, Mark," she'd said, her voice icy with displeasure. "I've gone to considerable expense and pulled significant strings to arrange this evening. The doctor is flying in specifically to consult on your case. A case we never asked him to consult on, Mark replied firmly, and a dinner we never agreed to attend. So you're choosing Olivia's family over your own, after everything I've done for you? I'm choosing to spend the holiday with people who respect our boundaries, Mark countered, his resolve unwavering. People who don't try to manipulate us or discuss our private medical information in public settings. Barbara's tone shifted to wounded disbelief. I don't understand how you can speak to me this way. All I've ever done is love you and try to help you. We don't need the kind of help you're offering, Mother. What we need is respect. When he finally hung up, Mark looked simultaneously drained and relieved. She'll try again, he warned me. This isn't over. He was right, of course. Over the next 2 weeks, Barbara deployed every weapon in her arsenal. She called mutual friends to express concern about Mark's unusual behavior and my controlling influence. She showed up at his office with tears and guilt trips. She even attempted to convince my parents to intervene, a particularly misguided effort given their firm belief in marital privacy. Through it all, Mark maintained his newfound resolve, though I could see the emotional toll it was taking. This was the most prolonged and direct opposition to his mother he'd ever mounted, and decades of conditioning made it painful even when he knew it was necessary. Then, 3 days before Christmas, everything changed. I was in the middle of a physical therapy session with a long-term client when my receptionist interrupted, looking concerned. Olivia, I'm sorry, but your husband is online too. He says it's urgent. Alarmed, I excused myself and took the call. Mark, what's wrong? It's Barbara, he said, his voice tight with emotion. She collapsed at her charity luncheon. They've taken her to Memorial Hospital. The doctors think it might have been a heart attack. My stomach dropped. Despite our difficult relationship, I wouldn't wish such a health crisis on anyone. I'll meet you there. Which floor? Cardiac unit. 4th floor. Thank you for coming. I rearranged my afternoon appointments and drove to the hospital, my mind racing. Was this a genuine emergency or another of Barbara's manipulations? It felt callous even considering the latter, but her history made skepticism unavoidable. Either way, Mark needed support, and I was determined to provide it. The cardiac waiting room was crowded with holiday decorations that seemed jarringly cheerful against the backdrop of anxiety. Thomas was already there, pacing by the windows, while Rebecca sat quietly with little Richard, who was coloring in a holiday-themed activity book. Any news? I asked as Thomas spotted me. He shook his head. Mark's with her now. They're running tests, but they think it was actually a severe panic attack, not a heart attack. Her EKG looks normal. Relief washed over me. That's good news. Is it? Thomas looked troubled. A panic attack severe enough to mimic a heart attack isn't exactly minor. And the doctor mentioned her blood pressure is dangerously high. Rebecca joined us, leaving Richard absorbed in his coloring. The cardiologist mentioned stress as a likely contributor, she said quietly. Apparently, Barbara was quite agitated. At the luncheon, telling everyone about her ungrateful children who were abandoning her for Christmas. I winced. Even in medical distress, Barbara had maintained her narrative of familial betrayal. The door to the waiting room opened, and Mark appeared looking exhausted. I moved immediately to his side, taking his hand in mine. How is she? Thomas asked. Stable, Mark replied. It wasn't a heart attack, thankfully, but her blood pressure is concerning. They want to keep her overnight for observation and adjustment of her medications. Is she awake? Can we see her? Thomas inquired. Mark nodded. She's asking for everyone, though. He hesitated, glancing at me. She specifically asked to speak with Olivia alone first. I blinked in surprise. Me? Why? I don't know. But you don't have to if you're not comfortable. I considered refusing. After all Barbara had done, a private audience seemed potentially fraught, but curiosity won out. That, and the knowledge that refusing would only reinforce her martyrdom narrative. It's fine, I assured Mark. What room? 412. I'll walk you there. As we moved through the sterile hospital corridors, Mark squeezed my hand. Thank you for coming, and for being willing to talk to her. Of course, whatever our issues with Barbara, I'd never want her to be ill or alone. Just be careful, he warned as we approached her room. Even unwell, she's still herself. Barbara looked smaller somehow against the white hospital bedding, her usual perfect appearance diminished by the institutional gown and the absence of her careful makeup. Monitors beeped steadily beside her, an IV dripping fluid into her arm. Despite these clinical trappings, her eyes were alert and calculating as I entered. "Olivia," she said, her voice weaker than usual but still commanding. "Come sit by me." I approached cautiously, taking the visitor's chair beside her bed. "How are you feeling?" "Like someone squeezing my chest in a vice," she replied bluntly. "The doctors say it's stress. Imagine that." I wasn't sure how to respond, so I simply nodded. "You know why I'm here, don't you?" Barbara continued, her gaze sharp despite her physical vulnerability. "The doctors mentioned a panic attack and high blood pressure," I offered neutrally. She waved this away impatiently. "I'm here because my family is being torn apart, because my son won't be at Christmas dinner, because traditions that have stood for generations are being discarded." Even from a hospital bed, she was launching an offensive. I took a deep breath, reminding myself of her condition. "Barbara, I'm sorry you're unwell. Truly. But Mark and I made our decision about Christmas Eve for valid reasons that have nothing to do with rejecting family traditions. Nothing to do with..." She cut herself off, closing her eyes briefly as if gathering strength. When she opened them again, the calculation had been replaced by something that looked almost like genuine emotion. "Do you know what it's like? To lose your husband of 30 years? To suddenly find yourself alone?" The abrupt shift caught me off guard. "No, I don't. That must have been incredibly difficult." Difficult doesn't begin to describe it. Richard was my world. When he died, Mark became my anchor. My connection to everything that mattered. Her voice wavered slightly. "And now you're taking him away." "I'm not taking Mark anywhere," I replied gently but firmly. "He's making his own choices as an adult. As your son, not your husband." Barbara flinched as if I'd slapped her. What a cruel thing to say to someone in a hospital bed. It wasn't meant to be cruel. But it is the truth, and perhaps one you need to hear. Mark loves you, but he's established his own life, his own family with me. That doesn't mean he's abandoning you. It means he's living as his father raised him to be, an independent, honorable man. For a moment, genuine emotion flashed across Barbara's face. Pain, fear, perhaps even a flicker of recognition. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, her mask of control returned. "The Newport called yesterday," she said, abruptly changing the subject. "They wanted to confirm the final headcount for Christmas Eve. I told them we would all be there, as planned." I stared at her in disbelief. "Barbara, we already told you we won't be attending." "And I nearly died today," she countered, gesturing to the medical equipment surrounding her. "Surely that changes something. Or are you truly so cold that you'd deprive a woman who might not have many Christmases left of her son's presence?" The manipulation was so transparent it was almost laughable. Yet I felt a surprising stir of compassion beneath my frustration. Barbara's tactics were desperate because she herself was desperate, terrified of losing her position at the center of her son's world, of being relegated to the periphery of his life. "Your medical event today was frightening, and I'm genuinely relieved you're going to be all right," I said carefully. "But using it to emotionally blackmail Mark isn't going to work. Not anymore." Barbara's expression hardened. "So that's your final word? You won't even consider coming to dinner after what I've been through today?" "Christmas Eve is still 3 days away." Why don't you focus on recovering first? Then we can discuss holiday plans, ones that don't involve ambushing us with fertility, specialists, or undermining our marriage. I stood, ready to leave, when Barbara's next words stopped me cold. I made you, you know. Mark would never have looked twice at someone like you if I hadn't taught him to be charitable toward those less fortunate. You should be thanking me for raising a son willing to marry beneath his station. The venom in her voice was startling after her previous display of vulnerability. This, I realized, was the real Barbara, the one she'd kept carefully concealed, behind social niceties and the veneer of maternal concern. Thanking you? I repeated, finding myself oddly calm in the face of her naked hostility. For what, exactly? For trying to control every aspect of our lives? For undermining Mark's career and our marriage at every turn? For treating me as an unwelcome intruder rather than a member of your family? You are not a member of my family, Barbara hissed, all pretense abandoned. You are a temporary inconvenience. Mark will eventually see reason and return to his proper place, with or without you. I looked at her for a long moment, seeing clearly for the first time the frightened, bitter woman beneath the polished exterior. I'm sorry you feel that way, Barbara. I truly am. Because Mark and I aren't going anywhere. We're building a life together, a happy one, with or without your blessing. As I turned to leave, Barbara called after me, her voice rising despite the monitors that began beeping more rapidly. You will regret this, Olivia. I've reserved that table at the Newport for years. Those reservations are impossible to get. Everyone who matters in this city will be watching to see if my family shows up. The pieces suddenly clicked into place. The Newport wasn't just an exclusive restaurant. It was a stage Barbara had selected for public validation of her family narrative. Her desperation wasn't just about our attendance. It was about maintaining appearances, about being seen at the right place with her perfect family performing their assigned roles. Mark was waiting anxiously in the hallway. How did it go? You were in there a while. Let's just say your mother finally dropped her mask, I replied quietly. She made her feelings about me very clear. His expression darkened. What did she say? Nothing I didn't already suspect, she thought. I took his hand. But I think I finally understand what the Newport dinner is really about for her. It's not about family at all. It's about being seen with her family, about public perception. Mark nodded slowly. That sounds like her. Christmas isn't about being together. It's about being seen together in the right place. A nurse hurried past us into Barbara's room, responding to the elevated heart rate monitors. Mark watched with concern. I should check on her. Of course, I'll wait with Thomas and Rebecca. The remainder of that evening passed in a blur of medical consultations and family discussions. Barbara was indeed keeping overnight for observation, but the doctors were optimistic about her condition. The cardiac event had primarily been anxiety-related, though her blood pressure remained concerning. As we prepared to leave the hospital, Mark pulled me aside. I've been thinking about the Newport. My heart sank. Please tell me you're not considering giving in after all this. No, he assured me quickly. Absolutely not. But I do have an idea. One that might finally make my mother understand where she stands in our lives. Christmas Eve arrived crisp and clear, with a dusting of fresh snow that transformed the city into a holiday postcard. My parents prepared a traditional meal that blended Chinese and American customs, dumplings alongside roast turkey, red bean soup, and pumpkin pie. Mark moved through our kitchen with the easy familiarity of someone truly at home, helping my father perfume the rice with star anise while I folded dumpling wrappers with my mother. Your husband, my mother commented in Mandarin as we worked, side by side, has a good heart, but it took him too long to see clearly. He's seeing clearly now, I replied in the same language. That's what matters. She nodded, satisfied. And the baby making? How is that progressing? I smiled at her directness, so different from Barbara's manipulative inquiries. Slowly, but we're working with good doctors. Good. No rush. The best fruit grows at its own pace. Her wisdom, delivered without pressure or judgment, washed over me like a balm after months of Barbara's pointed comments. As evening approached, Mark checked his watch. It's almost 6. Should we get going? My father looked confused. Going? I thought you were spending the evening here? We'll be back, Mark promised. There's just something we need to do first. The Newport was resplendent in holiday finery, its limestone facade illuminated by thousands of twinkling lights. The doorman greeted us with professional courtesy, checking our names against his list. Mr. and Mrs. Taylor. The rest of your party has already been seated in the private dining room. Right this way. Mark squeezed my hand as we followed him through the elegant restaurant. Ready? He whispered. I nodded, feeling strangely calm. Ready. The private dining room was a study in holiday opulence. Crystal chandeliers, fine china, elaborate floral arrangements in seasonal red and gold. Barbara sat at the head of the table in a designer dress, holding court among her assembled guests. Thomas and Rebecca were there, looking uncomfortable, little Richard fidgeting in his child-sized bow tie. Several of Barbara's friends from the country club filled the remaining seats, along with a distinguished-looking man I didn't recognize but suspected was the promised fertility specialist. Barbara's expression when she saw us was almost comical, shock giving way to smug satisfaction, as if our appearance confirmed her power over us. Mark! Olivia! You came after all. I knew you wouldn't disappoint me. Her voice carried across the room, drawing all eyes to our entrance. Everyone, my son and his wife, have joined us after all. I allowed her this moment of perceived triumph, knowing what was coming next. Mark approached the table but didn't sit down. Hello, Mother. You're looking well. I'm glad to see you recovered from your hospital stay. Much better, thank you, she preened. Nothing keeps a Taylor down for long. Now, let me introduce you to Dr. Henderson from Cleveland. He's very interested in discussing your situation. The distinguished man extended his hand. A pleasure to meet you both. Your mother has told me about your fertility challenges. Mark shook his hand politely but didn't engage with the topic. Instead, he addressed the entire table. Thank you all for coming tonight, but I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. Olivia and I won't be joining you for dinner. Barbara's smile froze. What do you mean? You're here now. We came to deliver a message in person since nothing else seems to get through. Mark's voice was calm but firm. Mother, your behavior has become unacceptable. Arranging medical consultations without our consent, attempting to manipulate us through public pressure and guilt, faking medical emergencies. I did not fake anything, Barbara protested, glancing anxiously at her assembled guests. Your panic attack was real, Mark acknowledged, but using it to try to force our compliance was manipulative, and it stops now. He turned to address the other guests directly. I apologize for the awkwardness of this moment, but my mother has left us no alternative. She was explicitly told we would not be attending tonight, yet she persisted in telling everyone we would be here, putting all of you in this uncomfortable position. Barbara rose from her seat, her face flushing with anger and embarrassment. Mark, that's enough. You're making a scene. No, Mother. You made this scene by refusing to respect our clearly stated boundaries, by bringing strangers into our private medical decisions, by treating Olivia as an enemy rather than as my chosen partner. The room had fallen completely silent, the other guests watching with expressions ranging from mortification to morbid fascination. Thomas caught my eye across the table and gave a small nod of support. We will not be attending any family functions where Olivia is not treated with the respect she deserves, Mark continued. We will not discuss our fertility journey with you or your specialists, and we will not allow you to manipulate us through public pressure or health scares. Barbara's composure cracked entirely. After everything I've done for you, the sacrifices I've made, this is how you repay me? By humiliating me in front of my friends? I'm setting boundaries, Mother. Healthy ones. Something I should have done years ago. Mark's voice softened slightly. We love you. We want you in our lives, but only if you can accept our terms. He placed an envelope on the table. This contains the names and contact information for several excellent family therapists. When you're ready to work on building a healthier relationship with us, we'll be there. With that, he took my hand, and we turned to leave. Barbara's voice, shrill with fury and panic, followed us. If you walk out that door, don't bother coming back. You're no son of mine. Mark paused but didn't turn around. I'll always be your son, Mother. But I'm Olivia's husband first. Merry Christmas. As we stepped out into the crisp December night, snowflakes beginning to fall around us, I felt Mark trembling slightly beside me. Are you okay? I asked softly. He took a deep breath, releasing it slowly. Yes. For the first time in as long as I can remember, I think I really am. We drove to my parents' house in comfortable silence, both processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. As we pulled into the driveway, the warm glow of holiday lights welcoming us, Mark turned to me with an expression of profound peace. You know, he said quietly, I always thought setting boundaries with my mother would feel like losing family. Instead, it feels like finally finding it. I leaned across to kiss him gently. Family isn't about blood or tradition or appearances. It's about love, respect, and belonging. Everything waiting for us inside this house. As we walked hand in hand toward the door, where my parents would be waiting with dumplings and patience and unconditional love, I realized that sometimes the family you choose and the boundaries you set make all the difference between suffering and joy. Barbara might eventually accept our terms and become part of our life in a healthier way. Or she might not. Either way, Mark and I would face it together, on our own terms, in our own home. And someday, when we did welcome a child into our family, they would know only love and respect, never manipulation or control disguised as care. That, perhaps, was the greatest gift we could offer the next generation. The freedom to be themselves, wholly and completely, within the safety of genuine family love. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.